I will 100% agree. No question for that.
She's coming.
All right. Yes.
Just the not to talk at the end of the, well, I has five or five, in fact. Why don't we do the
Questions all at the end.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
I'm just going to say that. Okay. So just a point of organization. Since we're running late on time, we're going to take questions after the second presentation. And so you'll just jot them down or try to write them so that you don't forget. Shirly Natan-Yulzary comes to us from Beit-Berl Academic College in Israel. She's an expert in Ugaritic narrative poetry. She's written on the tale of Akkad, the Baal cycle, Kirta, and she will be publishing the first Hebrew language edition and translation of these Ugaritic texts. Her talk is on scientific. Her talk is on performance and orality in Ugaritic epic literature.
Thank you. I'm also from Gordon College. Hello, everybody. And I would like to begin with a little story, imaginative story, and to take you to the 13th century Ugarit BCE. So I'll start my little story. Sometimes during the second millennium BCE, Ilumilku sat in the house of the high priest in Ugarit. He had spent the morning inscribing a clay tablet. He was not a simple scribe, but a man of high status, close to the court of King Nikmedu. He wrote his text in a unique cuneiform alphabetic script recently invented around the city of Ugarit for the use of the local scribes. Ugarit was a coastal city in North Syria that flourished in the third quarter of the second millennium. A national awakening was taking place in the Ugarit, and writing the present text in this particular script made Ilumilku very proud. He and the other scribes of Ugarit used this new script to write poetic, religious, and ritual texts. Now, towards noon, he inscribed the last words on the sixth tablet of the Baal cycle. He wrote, "The scribe is Ilumilku, the Shubanite, student of Atenu the diviner, chief of the priests, chief of the shepherds, the Thait of Nikmedu, king of Ugarit, lord of Yargubu, master of Tharmanu. Do the words inscribed on this colophon indicate that Ilumilku was a composer of this important epic, which was excavated at Ras Shamra, i.e. ancient Ugarit? Was he also the composer of the two other epic poems found in the same location and bearing a similar colophon? Some researchers argue that Ilumilku had embedded in these texts theological or ideological viewpoint relating to his contemporary political context. Does the view of Ilumilku as a composer or author stand the test of criticism? I think it doesn't. Before providing my particular answer, I'd like to point to the poem's sociocultural context and ask, for what purpose were the written texts composed? How and in what context were the written texts used? were these epics composed for the members of the royal family and elites, or were they intended for the entire population of the city? Were these poems created or put into written form for a specific historical event? Or perhaps were they meant to endure and be transmitted through the ages? If so, in what medium was their transmission supposed to occur? After all, only a single copy of each work has reached us. If the epics conveyed ideologies whose source was Ilomilku, could this message have been rejected by some sections of the society of Ugarit? These questions will serve me as a compass for my discussion of oral and written epic traditions. To support the claim that the three epics are not Ilomilku's original works in the modern sense, I shall point to the tablet's form and content. First, in terms of content, we should recognize that the three epic poems illustrate content of a local nature: cultural customs, human concerns, worldviews, religious beliefs, instructional concepts, and didactic models. For example, the Akkad epic expresses the critical concern for a male heir who will continue to perform ancestral cult rituals. Such rituals were most likely connected to the family burial chambers excavated under the floors of the houses in Ras Shamra. The mention of the Rapauma and Itanus company in the Kirda epic matches their mention in the cultic texts. Kirda, king of Hubur, and his princess Huraya may be characters of Hurrian provenance who were beloved by the Hurrians, a significant ethnic group in Ugaritic society. Going beyond the issue of local content, a more decisive critique of the modern notion of authorship can be based on an analysis of the form and conventional content of the epic texts and an examination of the tablets themselves. The three epics take a poetic form. They exhibit extensive oral aesthetics intended for the ear and not for the eye. The epics illustrate abundant use of verbatim repetitions. Listeners especially enjoy such technique when they can chant in unison together with the performer. The epics rely extensively on received oral tradition, i.e. various forms of conventions such as word pairs, formulae, climatic patterns, and fixed epic epithets. We find embedded nuggets, i.e. traditionals, metaphors, themes, and motifs, proverbial sayings, popular songs, and euphemisms derived from the unwritten local and extended Near Eastern pool of tradition. All of these means serve to engage the listening audience. The combination of large sections of formulaic narration with highly stylized and structured poems should be explained as a result of embedding cultural building blocks into the epic works. I will explain this in the next few minutes. Within the epics, we find 2 proverbial sayings and 4 song-like passages that are formulated as characters' direct discourse. They exhibit non-formulaic style, but have a neat, independent structure. Some of these passages display discrepancies with the framing narrative. All instances carry a general message. My assumption is that they have been reworked into the epics. The song-like passages are repeated verbatim in the epics, and if my theory about the integration of popular songs is correct, the repetition functioned as an invitation for the audience to join in. A known characteristic of epic literature is its incorporation of other genres, such as love songs, wisdom instructions, proverbs, laments, and we may therefore surmise that the Ugaritic epics also integrated such contemporary, independent oral traditions. This would certainly have been a powerful tool for rendering performances richly saturated with culturally recognizable themes. In other words, the written text preserved poems and sayings that were typically performed in oral medium in Ugaritic. These various elements taken together, the formulaic style, traditional nuggets, poetic forms, and the use of diverse conventions produce the familiarity that an audience can enjoy. This brings us to search for visible clues indicating that these epics were performed orally. The claim that the epic works were performed orally is strongly affirmed by a literary examination of the third tablet of the Akkad epic. The section that describes the messengers carrying the news of Akkad's murder to his father Daniel consists of several parts. The messengers are described as coming from afar. Next, a message about the murder is delivered in the first person. Then, the messengers arrive and deliver their message to Daniel. Upon hearing the bad news, Daniel collapses. There is an apparent redundancy in the sequence, and the sequence is unclear. Since the news about the murder is delivered to Daniel by the messengers only after their arrival, we may wonder who is the speaker and who is the addressee of lines 37 to 39. My preferred solution is to identify the subject of the first-person verb form, abashari kuma, with the performer, and this object expressed by the suffix with the audience. I, the performer, will tell you the audience. In other words, the performer interrupts the narrative here and addresses his audience directly, engaging them as if they were actual participants in the story as they hear the bitter news. The audience is involved at the precise moment of climax, just before Daniel discovers that his son has been murdered. Additional indication of oral performance of the works are performance instructions and perhaps graphic markings that the scribes imprinted on the tablets. Within the epic text, we find two instances of reading or singing instructions. The first occurs in the fourth tablet of the Baal cycle. The tablet reads, "And turn to the point in the text when the lads are sent." This is a scribal instruction demarcated by a double horizontal line above it and a single horizontal line below it. The second example appears as an inscription on the edge of the third tablet of the Akkad epic, and here one returns to the story. This note was probably meant to guide the performer of the epic and suggests that the written text was the basis for oral performance in front of an audience. It also suggests that these copies were not written recordings of a performer's oral delivery of the poem, but that the scribe was familiar with the sequence of the narrative and its repetitions, probably because he worked with previous copies he held before him. We do not have direct evidence of the performance of the epics themselves by professionals. However, the existence of such professionals is directly supported by the ritual texts. The root shar denotes the performance of a song by professional singers. According to one of the ritual texts associated with the royal family, a procession takes place with the participation of the king and his children. In this ritual, a specific official kadishu is to recite ragama and sing yashiru, a specific text for the Gatharama, celestial deities. Another text reads, "And a singer shall sing a song several times before the king." Other literary evidence of performance, sometimes in the context of a feast, appears in the poetic texts. Considering this evidence, the royal origin of the ritual texts, and the existence of long poetic texts in Ugaritic, The conclusion is unavoidable that there was a class of professional performers of poetic texts, and probably also of epic songs, who performed in a royal and cultic context in the city and its temples. Kings in Ugarit were the patrons of music, and it stands to reason that a writing and performance of epic texts during the final phase of the Ugarit's existence took place under royal patronage. What about transmission? Direct evidence of scribal or oral transmission in Ugarit is lacking except for possible generation of written copies of the three epics. But later literary echoes of the Ugaritic texts from the second millennium and beyond show that myth epic works, or parts of them, were well known throughout the Levant, and the stories were apparently disseminated and transmitted at later periods, developed and changed. Two traditions from Ugarit are known to have circulated in other cultures. The first is the Baal-Yam conflict. The second is a story about a god copulating with a heifer. Some of these traditions that spread beyond Ugarit show signs of intercultural contact. The stories of the heroes Kirta and Danel most probably circulated from very ancient times, unlike the Kirta epic, for which we have no extant evidence of its circulation. There is evidence for the circulation of the Akkad epic as early as the 18th century BCE. A hematite cylinder seal from Syria dated 7050 to 1600 BCE shows two scenes recalling the Akkad epic. The prophet Ezekiel sitting in the Kevar Canal in Babylon in the 6th century BCE evokes the epic hero Danel. The book of Judith, whose composition is dated to the Hasmonean period, tells a story about a heroine who overcomes a warlord. Judith's story is a parallel tradition to the third tablet of the Akkad epic. The Jewish tale appears after a long gap in time, yet is unattested in the interim period. The multiple examples of biblical verses that parallel verses from the Ugaritic myths and epic support the notion of West Semitic literature was known in Israel and perhaps was part of the Israeli scribe curriculum. I will mention only three famous examples. David's curse of Mount Gilboa parallels the drought description in the Akkad epic. Psalms 92 verse 10 is a very close parallel to Kotar Wachassis' words to Baal. And Proverbs 6 verses 16 to 19 is similar to the proverbial saying about abominations embedded in the Baal cycle. The evidence just cited points to the wide dissemination and development of the stories extending geographically and temporally into Hasmonean times. Yet we encounter a gap of centuries without written copies of these stories. We may hypothesize that these traditional pieces circulated and were transmitted in oral form. But let us now not forget that the tablets which preserve oral traditions also indicate scribal activity. There are traces of copying processes, i.e. copying errors, that are characteristics of textual transmission. Furthermore, the poetic form of the epic is ignored in the orthography. There is no consideration of poetic lines or any special verse arrangement in most of the tablets. On the contrary, the poetic text is written in a continuous sequence, like prose. Finally, I remind you that the attested instructions and scribal remarks appear. Hence, the possibility that these texts were recited or sung by professional singers directly from these particular written copies is unlikely. Now let us return to the 13th century Ugarit and to the question of composition, or to be more cautious, to the socio-cultural context of composition. On the one hand, we find echoes of wide dissemination of the stories. On the other hand, scribal errors attest that the tablets were copied from a written source. It follows then that the texts were transmitted orally, but also in writing, at least within a bounded time period towards Ugaric's final days. The small number of copies found may be explained by the predominantly oral orientation of this ancient culture. The careful examination of form and content reveals that the dense presence of oral aesthetics, reliance on traditional building blocks, and numerous techniques to engage the listening audience. Additionally, the works were presumably intended to be performed, recited or sung orally, and enjoyed probably at public social and cultic events. This leads me to consider the possibility that these written records were not solely for the use of scribes or other reading audiences. Although the tablets do bear signs of scribal activity, they simultaneously include both performance instructions and scribal marks. One can hypothesize that the crystallization of the epic work's written form was actively influenced by a living oral tradition, and that the scribe initially intended the written works to be recited orally or performed in song. Seen in this light, the epic work embodies the audience's past and present. The reliance on the pull of tradition connects the listeners to their past, but also incorporates the present by embedding popular songs and other content relating to beliefs, cults, and social structures, and by conveying a didactic or ideological message that is specifically relevant to the audience. The performance of the epics is a shared event between a performer and audience, and they mean more than the sum of their content, ideologies, and ethical message. Performance and its embedded context are crucial to their meaning. Now, assuming that the written texts reflect the traditional oral background, contain signs of oral performance, and scribal transmission, how can we explain Ilimilku's role and respond to the claim that Ilimilku inserted his own individual theological or political message? Scholars have regarded Ilimilku's signature in the colophons of the epic works as evidence in favor of the model of original creative authorship. Although casting Ilimilku as a poet and ideologue, according to the modern notion of authorship, might explain the existence of a single copy of each text, this idea does not stand the test of criticism for several reasons. First, we cannot account for colophons as evidence of the authorship of a scribe. Second, scribal errors resulting from the copying mechanism are evident in the orthography. These copying byproducts undermine this theory that the texts were one-time creations composed by an individual. Finally, the above possibilities do not consider the oral-written nexus. Comparative perspectives in the study of oral societies in which writing technology had been recently introduced have led scholars to conclude that oral and written traditions can and do interact in various ways. These possibilities invites us to propose a model of interaction between writing and oral traditions in Ugaritic. Various and sometimes contradictory models have been suggested to explain the relationship between written and oral forms. The performer recited the epic by heart, and the written copy served only as aide-memoire, or perhaps the written copies were means for preserving an oral tradition, and were not used by the performer at all. These models do not satisfactorily explain the features of Ugaritic epic texts, nor does the scribe-composer model square with the evidence of aspects of oral performance and composition deriving from a theory of authorship by an individual scribe associated with the royal household, whose texts were meant to buttress some political agenda. Conversely, if the epics were to be performed, why were the oral texts put into written form and copied? Who used the text, the tablets? Who used the tablets? In what way? And for what purpose? If these texts were composed with the intention to impart a specific didactic, political, or theological message to the public, how were they distributed? Despite the urban context, written texts were inaccessible to the majority of the illiterate population. These questions are not adequately resolved. Now, I wish to put forward a theoretical model which may answer these issues and explain the interrelation of oral and written traditions in Ugarit. This model tentatively explains why Ilimilku and other scribes wrote down the ancient traditions, and it may also contribute to an understanding of Ilimilku's role, a topic of further research. I would like to consider the possibility that the interaction between oral and scribal cultures was not limited to the activities of creating and transmitting text in the two different medium. These worlds were not separate, but were rather two aspects of the same cultural practice, which included performance of both oral and written texts. Was Ugarit a scene of cooperation between performer and scribe? Because writing was in the possession of the elite, especially scribes related to the royal house, any collaboration between an oral performer and a scribe would have taken place under royal patronage. The royal house had both an interest in embedding religious, didactic, or political ideology in traditional texts, as well as the motivation to disseminate these texts through oral performances before a wide audience in the capital city and in Ugaritic language. A recent study by Gilbert of the city's public squares lends possibility to this idea. The urban features of Ras Shamra show evidence of collective feasts and cultic events sponsored and conducted by the royal family and especially the king. Presumably, such communal events did not only include ritual activity and feasting, but also other kinds of activity that engaged participants interactively. Although we have no textual descriptions of professional singers performing the epics before an audience, we do find mentions of professional singers in ritual texts, where the context of royal patronage is clear. Comparative materials from Emmer and Mari also support the thesis that public rituals included a performative aspect. The combined evidence of the epic's oral and traditional aspects alongside the above-mentioned findings support the conclusion that the performance of the epics was part of the social religious life in Ugarit, presumably by a professional singer, perhaps with the musical accompaniment within the city under royal auspice. Our knowledge of the existence of scribes, musicians, and singers lends credence to the idea that literate scribes and illiterate professional singers collaborated in the performance and the perpetuation of epic poetry. Professional singers rely on rich oral tradition and use their talent to engage their intended audience, which is illiterate. These performers were well capable of producing new variants of oral traditions in the service of royal agenda. The use of epic traditions is a powerful tool in the hands of the monarchy when it is wielded intelligently, on the basis of what is acceptable to the audience, for example, through performers who rely extensively on poetic conventions, the traditional repository, culture, and other oral texts in which they are proficient, and more importantly, which are familiar to the recipients. Relying on tradition gives validity to the performance and promotes the reception of a new variant tradition shaped for political and national or other needs. In other words, one can speculate that the epic texts were written as a royal or official version intended for the distribution under royal auspice through oral performances at communal feasts sponsored by the king. The written texts may have reflected the king's preferred variants approved for public consumption. To conclude my argument, I propose that oral performances were not only a means for disseminating the ideologies embedded in the texts. The king may have had scribes, musicians, and singers collaborating within the city. Through the performance of these epics in public events, the king aimed to strengthen affiliation and national unity among the diverse groups that populated the city of Ugarit. Ilimilku was active in the transmission of the text in writing, but there is no certainty that he copied the text from earlier copies precisely. What can be said in certainty is that the epics, in their recorded form, were a royal working plan for professional singers. Thank you.
Questions at the end. We're going to do questions. Okay, our next speaker is Martina Rodon. She comes